Going to be kind of going over today pest control. Let me switch scenes. Excuse me. We're going to be going over pest control. This is one of the things that I know that they've kind of touched on in the past with the AP exam. So this is something there's a ton of courses that kind of relate into this, but you sometimes hear it referred to as IPM or integrated pest management. But we'll get into all of that. So to outline what we're going to go through, we're going to talk about pests and pesticides, the uses and types of pesticides, the benefits, and then obviously the problems that are associated with the overuse of it and what some alternatives to those are, how to reduce exposure to them, and then regulating use. So pests and pesticides. So biological pests, these are organisms that reduce the availability, quality, or value of resources useful to humans. Only about 100 species of organisms cause 90% of crop damage, and as you guessed, insects are the most frequent pests. A friend of mine, when he was getting his master's, was doing a lot with pest management by developing GMOs. So there's different ways to kind of go about controlling them. Insects make up about 3/4 of all of the species that are used that cause problems. And they tend to be generalists. Generalists meaning that they compete effectively against specialist species and specialized endemic species. They eat almost everything, while specialists are very fixated on one thing that they generally eat. So the generalists just have a way to kind of outcompete them, because if they can't get access to that thing that the specialist needs, they can easily just move on to something else. And then if that plant becomes scarce, they can move on to something else, and it gives them kind of a wide variety of what they can and can't eat. So pesticides, these are any chemical that repels or kills pests. There has been kind of a push toward the repelling part of this lately. So rather than actually trying to kill the pests, you just make it so that whatever they're trying to consume or whatever they're doing on the plant, it's just unpalatable. So a biocide, it kills a wide range of organisms. Usually this results in stopping either the electron transport chain or neutralizing a protein that's responsible for life that's required. There's also herbicides, which kill plants by interrupting photosynthetic processes. There are insecticides that kill insects. Usually these act upon exoskeleton formation. Fungicides kill fungus. I'm not exactly sure of the mechanism of action with that. There's I always hate that. It's acaricides. These kill mites, ticks, and spiders. I don't remember the exact mechanism of action of those. There's nematicides. These kill nematodes. And rodenticides, which kills rodents. And finally, avicides, which kill birds. Usually the ones that kill birds, they go after bone or feather production. It's actually really common if you want to find out like toxicity levels of a certain chemical within the environment. It's really easy to collect feathers from birds and analyze those. And they've used that historically because a lot of times feathers will be stored from birds, and they can use those to collect historic data. I remember hearing about how they were trying to test mercury levels in water released from Exxon Valdez that was not collected at the time. And they did that by collecting bird feather samples that were held within museums and things like that. And they were able to measure levels within that. So pest control and history. Sumerians controlled insects with sulfur around 5,000 years ago. This was one of the first big groups of humans that we have decent documentation on. The Chinese described mercury and arsenic to control pests 250 years ago. You can see how crude this is. Obviously, we know that depending on the form that mercury is in, it's toxic, and arsenic is toxic in general. People have used organic compounds and biological compounds or biological controls for the longest time. So biological controls is something that I studied for a small bit just because of control of invasive species using biological methods. The Romans burned fields and rotated crops to reduce diseases. Again, the Romans, we kind of think of them as very primitive, but a lot of what we know about modern day society comes out of Roman culture because they had such a large population. They needed to feed that population, and politics played a big hand in that. Apologize for the noise in the background. There's a street sweeper going by right now. So synthetic chemical pesticides. Modern era pest control began in 1934 with DDT, which is a really common pesticide. It's used for the longest time. It's cheap, stable, soluble in oil, and can easily be spread over a large area. A lot of pilots, after they came out of World War I, and a lot of the pilots who were then drafted into World War II, used to fly to disperse DDT over crop fields. It was highly toxic to insects, but relatively non-toxic to mammals. And Paul Mueller received a Nobel Prize in 1948 for the discovery of it. So pesticide uses and types. Pesticides use increased dramatically since World War II. Obviously, we've showed graphs before of human population increases. As the human population tends to increase, we have to feed them. Therefore, we have more agricultural land. Therefore, we're using more pesticides in order to get more yield out of our farmland. Almost nothing in 1950s, and then up to 33 billion in 1990 with 2.6 metric tons. So you could just see how the amount grew. 90% of pesticides are used in agriculture or food storage and shipping. This just kind of reiterates the importance of food storage, and agriculture. The street sweeper just blew an insane amount of dust all over my car. In the US, household applications represent about 12% of pesticide use, but almost 23% of insecticide use. This is mostly because insects in homes are kind of a general sign of cleanliness, and therefore those insecticides are used quite a bit, while pesticides in general tend to be used a little bit more in houses that are trying to either like beautify lawns or different things like that. So pesticides types. Inorganic pesticides, these are broad spectrum. Broad spectrum is a fancy way of saying that they kind of go after everything. They're generally highly toxic. Again, with that broad spectrum, it is toxic to almost everything. This is why it's broad spectrum, because you could spray it on something and it'll probably kill it. And it's essentially indestructible, meaning that the chemical compound that forms the core of the pesticide is extremely stable and can last for a long period of time. So arsenic as an example. Generally, they're neurotoxins, so they go after neurotransmitter formation or brain cells, and they clog the ion channels up, or they stop ion channels. So some of them actually stop neurotransmitter release. Some of them actually interact with the neurotransmitter, so they can't be taken up. And others will bond to the ions that are located in or around neurons in order to stop the action potential from occurring. Then there's natural organic pesticides. These are sometimes referred to as botanicals, and these are extracted from plants. So an example is nicotine. So nicotine, caffeine, a lot of these things are plant-produced pesticides. Why? Why would a plant produce nicotine? Why would it produce caffeine? Well, these are appetite suppressants. So an insect comes up, starts chewing on a plant, it gets that into its system, and then it no longer chews on the plant. Does it actually kill the insect? Well, I mean, if it starves it out, then yes, but for the most part, it just sort of discourages that insect from eating it. Then there's fumigants. These are small molecules that gasify easily and penetrate materials rapidly. So carbon tetrachloride is a really common one. Ethylene dibromide is another one. The most common one you're going to hear about is carbon tetrachloride. When we discuss fumigants, that's kind of everybody's go-to example for a fumigant. Continuing on with pesticide types, so you have chlorinated hydrocarbons. These are fast-acting and highly toxic to sensitive organism. So DDT is an example. Mothballs, if you've ever seen those, are another example. Mothballs used to be really common that people would put those into closets in order to prevent moths from laying their larvae into clothing, since they go after natural fiber clothing. So an example is like wool suits or wool clothing. Insects will, or moths will lay their larvae onto there, where they will consume the fibers, and it's not seen right away. But once the garment gets washed and you start to see holes form, a lot of times this results from destruction of those fibers. So they inhibit nerve membrane ion transportation and block nerve signal transmission. So again, this is going back to that ion transport, stopping that from happening by bonding to those ions, and then the ions are therefore cannot interact. It creates this charge, or it negates the charge, and then blocking nerve signal transmission as a result of ion transport. Sometimes they can actually physically block uptake membrane proteins. And then they're pretty persistent. They tend to biomagnify quite a bit, meaning that if they are in an insect and that insect has not died but is consumed by another animal, that it will persist within that. Is it toxic? Unless the organism is sensitive to it, it tends to not be toxic. So organophosphates is another version. These are extremely toxic to mammals, birds, and fish. Malathion is an example. This came from a lot of nerve gas research that happened in World War I and World War II. Organophosphates are not used as much. These have been, because of just how toxic they are, their use has been kind of curtailed within mostly the last 40 years. And these inhibit neurotransmitter enzyme function. Again, this is actually going after proteins. Carbamates, these are similar to organic phosphates. So 7 is an example. These are extremely toxic to bees. When they were looking at colony collapse disorder, they started to kind of sort through pesticides quite a bit. Say, okay, what pesticides might be a result of this, or what might be coming about with all this. And carbamates was one of them that they really went after. There's also biological controls. You could use microbial agents, bacteria, parasitic wasps. Parasitic wasp was really common for a while. There was a invasive species. I don't remember what it was, but it was introduced into Canada. I think it was an unintentional introduction, and it started to go rampant, destroy a lot of plants and crops. So then there was this conversation of, okay, there is a natural predator for it. It's a parasitic wasp that goes after that insect intentionally. Let's introduce that. So they introduced that parasitic wasp as a biological control. And then it turned out it was a generalist and went after a lot of other organisms. And so now there's 2 invasive species that were introduced as a result of that. So there are mixed results with biological controls. So then another one is disease control with the pesticide benefit. Many insects serves as disease vectors. So a friend of mine, he looked at soybean aphids. Why did he look at soybean aphids? Because they move soybean mosaic virus around. They are a vector for this disease. They land on one soybean, that has soybean mosaic virus, they draw up phloem, they fly to another plant that is not infected, and then they go to draw up more phloem and end up passing the disease on that way. So two big examples for humans, at least, are malaria and yellow fever. If you want to point to any vector in general, mosquitoes is a big one. There is a massive field of research right now in mosquito population control. Malaria is one of the deadliest diseases on the planet right now, and it requires mosquitoes as a vector. There's a life cycle of Plasmodium, the parasite that causes malaria, that occurs within the mosquito. So there's been all sorts of effects, using pesticides in order to control mosquitoes, releasing sterile males, releasing sterile females. There has been all sorts of control with some limited success in trying to control mosquitoes. But this is a big one because of just how many diseases are passed along. Yes, prevention, where you can use nets and things like that in order to try to stop them from biting humans, but it is mosquito control is a massive area of research in biology. It's also crop protection too. Using pesticides pre-harvest losses to disease and pests are at 30%, with post-harvest losses at an additional 20 to 30%. Excuse me. This just kind of shows that you could get more money out of your fields, because as a farmer, you need to make money to feed your family, and so you deploy pesticides in order to get more yield. And then as a society, we obviously want more food so that we can feed more people. And it also brings the cost of our food down through supply and demand. In general, farmers save an average of $3 to $5 for every $1 spent on pesticides. So that right there, that sounds pretty good. You spend $1,000 on pesticides, you get $3,000 to $5,000 back as profit from your crop yield. There obviously is a point where, as you spend more money, you don't get as much of a yield back. So problems associated with pesticides, one of the biggest ones, and this is a massive concern, is non-target species. Up to 90% of pesticides never reach their intended target. You spray it onto a field and it doesn't actually make it to where it's supposed to go. There's also pesticide resistance. Resistant members of a population survive pesticide treatment and produce more resistant offspring. Notice it's resistance, and not that they're immune to it. Common example of this is mosquitoes. There are mosquitoes out there that are resistant to pesticides, and those are the ones that survive every year to mate and have offspring, therefore perpetuating the cycle of them having more offspring. So this leads to a pest resurgence. Let's say you have 1 million mosquitoes and 25% of those are resistant to a pesticide. So you spray a pesticide, you've effectively reduced your mosquito population by 750,000. Then the next year, those 250,000 which survived are going to start to reproduce, and you're going to end up back at 1 million. But those 1 million are now going to be resistant to your pesticide. And that kind of puts you into a conundrum. You switch pesticides, use higher concentrations. Like, how do you go about those controls? UN reports at least 500 insect pest species and 250 weeds and plant pathogens has developed some sort of chemical resistance. Farmers are continually changing dosages and chemicals in order to fight these resistant pests. And increasingly, pests are being found to be resistant to chemicals that they have not been exposed to. So if you were to spray a novel pesticide out onto your field, a lot of times they're discovering that insects are resistant to these pesticides, even though they've never been exposed to them before. And this right here creates kind of a concern to it, because you've just released a pesticide that is not effective. And again, it might end up on a non-target species. Genetically engineered crops are likely to exacerbate this problem, because it's now exposing insects to more chemicals within the plants that they may be resistant to. So this shows pesticide resistance. So number of species being on your y-axis, year on your x-axis. Notice how the number of species for insects and mites have increased, plant diseases have increased, and weeds have increased. Why is this the case? Well, first off, we know more about these different species now, so that's lead to an increase in data, but also the amount of pesticide use, remember, has increased since the 1950s. So if you look around the 1950s, we do have some that are resistant, and then the number of species do tend to increase after that. Creation of new pests. Broadcast spraying is also likely to kill beneficial predators. Remember, there are natural biological controls that exist for these species, and you want to reduce the amount of pests while keeping the amount of predators. So there's kind of this two-pronged approach at controlling pests on agricultural fields. Under normal conditions, many herbivorous pets are controlled by natural predators, maybe not to the extent that we would like, but there is a level of control in there. Remember the lynx hare analogy, where as the number of rabbits or the number of hares increase, its predator, the lynx, will increase with that. So there is a method of control that is built into it. With advent of chemical pest controls, farmers tend to abandon traditional methods of pest pathogen controls. We can see this quite a bit in the US. It tends to be a little bit less common in Europe because there are tighter controls on pesticides, chemical pesticides. And so we tend to see a lot more of a dynamic approach in Europe, especially in the UK, compared to within the United States. Mixed crops, and then also rotation regimes. Some of the research that I did looked at over yielding by using diverse cultures of crops versus monocultures, and you do tend to get more out of monocultures with the detriment of soils. I was looking more at native wildflowers and plants compared to crops. Environmental persistence and mobility. So because chlorinated hydrocarbons, or DDTs, are so persistent, they often show up far from the dispersal point. So they're persistent, they stay in the environment, they're also chemically stable, and you end up finding them just about everywhere. They're stored in body fat because, remember, these are they are soluble in oil, and they tend to bioaccumulate. High levels detected in upper levels of the food chain. This is through biomagnification. Remember that if you have one milligram of a pesticide within an insect, a bird isn't just going to eat one insect and end up with that same 1 milligram within it. It's going to eat multiple insects and add that to it. On top of that, if it's stored in body fat, it's going to store in there for long periods and bioaccumulate. And then everything that eats that bird is going to end up in that same situation. DDT was banned in the US for over 20 years, but high levels are still detected in some areas. This was highly controversial when it was banned. It was a pretty big thing because it was such a widely used pesticide. And then once, the effects kind of came out about it, there was a lot of resistance to it. If you're wondering how can people be resistant to science, just look up any coronavirus protester. So many persistent organic pollutants were globally banned in 2001. Remember, these are organic compounds, which means that our bodies are going to take them up relatively easily. Use was banned or restricted in developing countries for years. But between 1994 and 1996, the U.S. shipped more than 100,000 tons of DDT and persistent organic pollutants annually. Just because the use here is banned doesn't mean the manufacturing is banned. And so companies still continue to produce. Many return to U.S. and agricultural products or migrating wildlife. If we ship a lot of this stuff to South America, countries that are developing and may not necessarily have a ban on those pesticides, and there's movement of agricultural products or wildlife migrating, it is going to bring some of that back with it. So the big thing that this counts into is human health problems. We tend to be pretty self-centered, so how does this actually affect us? Well, the WHO estimates that 3.5 to 5 million people suffer acute pesticide poisoning, and around 20,000 die each year. at least 2/3 resulting from occupational hazards in developing countries. What this means is 2/3 of them being people that actually work on the farm. So looking at 200,000, or I'm sorry, looking at 20,000, you're talking around 12 that are dying every year, 12,000 that are dying every single year from pesticide exposure. Long-term health effects are difficult to conclusively document. A lot of this is because it results in long-term exposure to these chemicals, and it is unethical to sit there and intentionally expose people to it. So the only thing that we really have is case studies. And a lot of times it can be difficult to kind of draw a conclusion from them because, you know, if somebody lives to be 80 years old and then dies from pesticide exposure, there's a lot of other compounding issues that might have resulted in that death too. So PCBs have been linked to learning deficiencies within children. This is a pretty easy one to link. But there has been a lot of pushback and resistance when it comes to this. And a lot of it happens with intake during mother's pregnancy. That stuff is then transferred onto the child as brain development is occurring. Alternatives. So again, like I said, it's easy to identify a problem. It's more difficult to identify a solution. So behavioral changes. Using something like crop rotation. Instead of using so many pesticides, you plant soybeans. Soybean aphids start to show up onto your fields. Rather than planting soybeans the next year, you plant corn. And then now these aphids have no food source, and then they have to move on. Mechanical cultivation is an example where you can use machinery in order to kind of handle a lot of the agricultural uses. Flooding fields has been something that was really common. It's not used as much now, but it used to be really common that fields were flooded, and this would get to a lot of the larval states. Because remember, when an insect is still in the larval state, it's still required to bring in oxygen in order to have cellular respiration. By flooding it, you deny them that. Habitat diversification. This one is the one that I said was really common in Europe. This is where farmers a lot of times will plant trees and stuff along hedgerows. This allows a lot of like birds and other predatory animals to have a habitat, allowing them to go into fields and kill a lot of the insects and pests that are on the fields. Compare that to in the US, where farmers tend to spray a lot along their drainage ditches or along streams nearby in order to kind of kill all those weeds, because it was thought for the longest time that if you add a lot of those plants along there, that it would prevent it would either harbor pests or it would prevent water from draining off of your fields into the stream, because the plants would block it. We know that that's incorrect now. Also growing in pest-free zones. So it's just establishing areas where there are no soybean aphids or there are no insects that will go after your crops. A common one now in southern Indiana is there's a weevil that's going after squash. And so now squash is not a common crop that's grown in southern Indiana because of this insect. Adjust planting times. Pests have and insects have, they follow growing degree days. So plant it outside of their time period when they tend to be the most common or they tend to be persistent. And also plant mix polycultures. This does result in a lower yield, but you can get a higher yield out of it if you're not losing a large portion of your crops to pests. And then there's biological controls. Like I said, these kind of have mixed results. So this is predator or herbivorous insects, genetic and bioengineering, which that kind of hit some kind of rough flack around 10 years ago, moving forward, where there was a big GMO scare. Using different hormones to control feeding habits and reproduction of insects. Sex attractants, which will result in insects leaving certain areas, specifically males leaving certain areas. And then this leads into integrated pest management. This is kind of the key goal of any pest management. A flexible ecological based strategy that uses a combination of techniques applied at specific times aimed at specific pests. This is where you're using every single thing that's available in your arsenal. Tries to minimize the use of chemical controls and avoids broad spectrum controls. Employs economic thresholds to determine the point at which potential economic damage justifies control expenditures. This has a lot that goes into it. It's not only producing the chemicals, but it's also looking at, okay, how much, like you get $3 to $5 of savings for every dollar spent on pesticides. Okay, so if I spend $1 million on pesticides, that means I'm going to save $3 million, right? Well, no, that's not the case, because there might not be that much control. There is a sweet spot in there, and it's trying to find that sweet spot in order to kind of find out, like, okay, how much should I spend in order to control pests, and where is it that if I spend another dollar, that now instead of saving $5, I'm only saving $4.50? Like, where is that threshold point at? So reducing pesticide exposures. Less than 10% of active pesticides ingredients have been subjected to a full battery of chronic health effect tests. A lot of this just has to do with time and the amount of money involved with it. Of the 321 pesticides screened, EPA reports 146 are probable human carcinogens. And since 1972, only 40 pesticides have been banned. There's a lot of economic reasons that are behind this. You know, if you are one of the companies that produces a pesticide that's potentially dangerous, if it gets banned, that cuts into your bottom line. So how are these regulated? Well, the EPA, FDA, and USDA all share federal responsibilities regulating pesticides used in food production in the U.S. The EPA regulates sales and use and sets tolerance levels. When I talked last time about the use of atrazine and how we couldn't detect what the toxic level of atrazine was because our measuring instruments did not go that low, a lot of that was done by the EPA, or the EPA kind of gives that responsibility out to scientists. So an example is the SEEP project, where they're looking at toxic levels of different agrochemicals that end up into streams and waterways on the various things that live in those streams and waterways. And this is a massive effort. There's a ton of money going out in grants. And so it's a big project, and everyone is kind of contributing their small chunk to this larger overall project. Dr. Gillespie at Purdue Fort Wayne is one of them that has money for a SEEP project, and he's doing a lot of research with looking at this. The FDA and USDA enforce pesticide use and tolerance levels set by EPA. So once the EPA kind of says this is what the level you can use is, the FDA and the USDA are responsible for actually going out there and doing kind of the enforcement of those regulations. 1999, EPA banned use of methylparathione on all fruit and many vegetables and limited the quantity of Zenfos methyl that can be used on foods common in children's diets. Studies show children are more susceptible than adults to toxic pesticides because they're still developing and have less natural protections. So to kind of summarize, we had discussed pests, the different kinds, and what actually is a pest. We talked about pesticides, the use and types, benefits, the problems associated with it, some alternatives, how to reduce exposure, regulating use. So the big kind of takeaway from this is integrated pest management. How can we use different forms or different forms of pest control to regulate to control pests? Because looking at this picture, you could see one of the things we talked about last time was bare ground. This space in between plants where there's just bare ground and can lead to soil erosion. but that's required to get out here and kind of control pests. So could we put something in that gap in order to control pests, but also allow for yield of whatever this crop is? And so that's where a lot of research is currently being done. Okay, so that'll end for today. One big thing, make sure that you get onto PowerSchool. There was information posted about the AP exam. There's practice tests so that you can see what the test will look like and how to go about doing all of that stuff. I will send an email out to every single person in AP Environmental Science today, but make sure that you are getting onto PowerSchool and checking your email and at least get onto this website. It does work with your phones. There's videos about how to submit everything. Make sure that you're watching those. Watch them a couple times so that when it comes test day, there's no surprise. With this test, you have, I think it's 45 minutes to take the test and then 15 minutes after that to submit it. I could be wrong with that. But make sure that you're aware of what all of those regulations or those rules are for AP so that you can fall in line, because if you don't, then a lot of times they will reject your test. So make sure that you're paying attention to that. But that is all I have for today. Enjoy your Friday and have a good weekend.